right, so tonight is going to be a study of essentially the seven-headed beast from Revelation 13. Obviously, in order to study that, we're going to have to look at passages beyond that. This is, in my assessment, sort of the backbone of all prophetic understanding, the subject matter, really, not the seven-headed beast per se, although understanding what the seven-headed beast represents is kind of gets to this issue of the larger view roadmap of biblical prophecy about the end of the age and the future. From Revelation 13 and the attached or related chapters in that book, and in Daniel in particular, this is like the broadest scale, like landscape of what the end of the world is going to look like, traced through human history in connection with particular themes and symbols that have a consistent use, that paints a picture of what the world will look like politically. That really is the kind of most universal way of describing things. If you think about it, like history in terms of world history is discernible no matter where you are in the world, especially in our world today, with the basic shared knowledge that we have about world history and geography and developments of civilization over time. And so regardless of language, regardless of any other factor, we can talk about things that we all know from these major world developments in history, these groups, these political powers. That's a universal language, sort of markers and things that we all share. And by attaching meaning to those things and then using that same kind of terminology, the Bible is able to present to us a picture of future developments along those lines that is understandable to us. And yet it's also veiled through the symbolic language that the Bible employs. So the root and the key to understanding the picture that the prophetic books present on the larger scale about the circumstances of world civilization and the end of the age, it comes down to some basic symbols and knowing history and just sticking to the system and the method that the Bible presents as close as we can. There's always going to be speculation in the component of trying to identify the specific real world people and geography and nations and timetable that fulfill the biblical symbols that are contained in prophecy. Like if you start to say, well, this symbol represents Russia, or this symbol represents this, there's always speculation in the identification in real world terms for us, at least until it happens. But the component that's not speculative, or at least we should try to avoid as much speculation as possible, is in the hermeneutic component. That is to say, letting the Bible explain itself in its own terms to us, rather than us inserting or changing those terms to suit our agenda or our ideologies or interests and political biases or expectations. And so the component of prophecy that is rooted in basic biblical interpretation practices, I think we should adhere to that as closely as we can, at least be aware of when we're stepping beyond that, and to start with this, that is the first, sort of foundation for any good development and understanding that will eventually require some identification in specific real world terms. So with that kind of said, we've done several other studies on end time stuff. This is kind of the one, normally I would start with because it kind of gets you the lay of the land. So, but we're going to do it last because I didn't want to leave it out of the series. And so what I want to do is I want to read Revelation 13, at least the first 12 verses, and then we'll start to tie this in with other things. And I think that the Bible does a really good job of giving us all the information we really need straightforwardly to piece together the basic puzzle and the framework that I think is fairly conclusive. Unfortunately, if we just stick to the biblical direction, the directions that are given, and we use the terms and the symbols the way the Bible itself uses them. I think the picture fits pretty well. But unfortunately, it's not one that I see a lot out there in terms of an understanding these things that is fully consistent with this. I think many Christians have good portions of this where they have a basic understanding of it, a shared understanding of it. And I've seen other authors who are similar in their understanding of the basic symbols that we're going to talk about tonight with regard to many components, particularly the historical piece, the past. But where there seems to be disagreement and difference the most is over what this means about the end times and the future of the symbolic imagery that we're given and what it means. And so this view that I'm going to put forward tonight is something that in this study group we've had intact, as I'm going to share it, since before 2001. It's been published since then, like online on our website. And so this isn't something that's shifted. It may need to be shifted at some point in the future with regard to the better applications in identifying the real world fulfillment. But I do think that by and large, a sound understanding of Bible prophecy and symbol should be able to withstand the test of time, because as long as you're just understanding what the symbol means rather than interpreting it to identify a particular real world country or person, the symbol stuff is just basic exegetical work, and that should be beyond the test of time, because it shouldn't be subject to the cultural biases of the day that you're doing the interpretation anyway. So, all right, let's read Revelation 13 and get started with this. Revelation 13:1 says, "I stood upon the sand of the sea." Some versions of this say that the devil stood upon or the dragon stood upon the sand of the sea. It's not particularly important to the symbol interpretation to decipher which one of those, who's standing on the sand of the sea. What's important is what comes next. And I saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And upon his 10 horns, 10 crowns, and upon his heads, the name of blasphemy. So the first thing I just want to pause on here is this idea that this beast rises up out of the sea. Sometimes people make a lot of importance about that. There may be some significance to the idea that this beast is arising out of the sea. But as you go down in this chapter into verse 11, we're going to see a reference to another beast that comes up out of the earth. And when we go and look at Daniel chapter 7, we're going to see a sort of similar interchangeability with these beasts all arising out of the sea and all arising out of the earth. And so for those of us who might want to explore the potential significance of coming up out of the earth or being on the sea, we do, I think, have to realize is that these terms are kind of applied to both cases, that all the animals featured in Daniel 7 and here seem to, in some respects, come out of the sea and yet also come out of the earth. So just be careful and make sure you're giving attention to all of those. For our purposes, I'm not concerned about the nature of what sea means. I'm more concerned about what this beast with 7 heads and 10 horns itself is meant to represent. It's a very strange depiction, this concept of an animal that looks like this. In verse 2, it says, "The beast that I saw, the 7-headed beast, was like unto a leopard. His feet were as of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion." Now, important to note here is that exactly how it's like a leopard isn't stated. It doesn't say it has the body of a leopard. It doesn't say it has the legs or back or hide of a leopard. It's just like a leopard somehow. We don't really know how. In determining how or why it's like a leopard may be important to understanding this, but I don't think that for the basic purposes, I'll explain why it's not important to necessarily know how it's like a leopard, because I don't think that's the intent of the reference to the leopard here. And so we have this beast. It has 7 heads. We don't know of any animals that have 7 heads. None, as far as I know, have more than one. And it has, it's being described in ways that include references to a lion, a bear, and a leopard. And we also know that it has 10 horns, which is important, as we'll see when we get to Daniel chapter 7. And it says the dragon gave him his great power, his seat, and great authority. So there's political power here. That's one of the words here that's being used for authority or power. It's the idea of rule over the earth, and we'll talk about that as we go on. The Bible depicts here and in other places more clearly that angels, particular angels, have authority over earthly nations during different times and periods. And verse 3 says, and I saw one of the heads, so this animal, this beast that's being used here as a symbol, has 7 heads, and one of those heads, it says, as it were, wounded to death, and the deadly wound was healed. Now, the other heads are not healed. They're not even wounded as far as we can tell here. So there is a very prominent or popular interpretation of this verse that persists, that it was important in certain fictional Christian books that took this to mean that this was a reference to the Antichrist, who was shot in the head or something in their version of it, and then he comes back to life from what appears to be a fatal head wound, like a gunshot wound to the head or something. That interpretation for me is just frankly impossible if you're using the biblical text itself, because unless you believe that the Antichrist has 7 heads and a body that's like a leopard and feet like a bear and a mouth like a lion and 10 horns on his head, then this is not talking about the Antichrist. And particularly, he doesn't have 7 heads. So what this is talking about is one of the heads. What is healed is something that's a part of this larger thing. And the head is not an individual human. If head is a symbol for an individual human, then the wound is not to his head anyway. So we're going to have to talk about what heads mean in terms of letting the Bible tell us what symbol, because this symbol here is not it's not originating from Revelation 13. This is an existing biblical symbolic reference, the way of talking about things. So we're going to let the Bible do the work for us there, and then we're going to interpret in light of the way the Bible talks about this. So this beast has 7 heads. One of these heads is wounded, and then that wounded head is healed. And all the world wondered after the beast, and they worshiped the dragon, which gave authority to the beast. That's exousia in the Greek. And they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like the beast, who was able to make war with him. And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power. Again, that's the word exousia, authority, political authority, governmental authority, was given unto him to continue for 42 months, which is 3.5 years. And we're not particularly in the study going to talk about timetables for the most part. I think I'll just stipulate that this is within a futurist premillennialist perspective, not here intending to argue about historicism or amillennialism or postmillennialism, anything like that. We're operating within the premillennial futurist point of view, which says these things have not, in our understanding, have not happened yet. They are yet to happen. And so we can do the other study on historicism and preterism and all that stuff some other time. But as interpreting these for the premillennial futurist view, all of this is happening in the final 3.5 years, final 7 years. So if you read through the rest of verse 10 down through verse 10, you see the idea of blasphemy and war being made against the saints, being given to this wounded head that has authority for 32 more months, which is interesting because the word continue is actually sort of articulated here in the Greek, right? That this is a continuation of authority that was once had by this wounded head, right? It was wounded, so it had in the past been in power, and then it loses its power, and now it's continuing. It's restored back to a position of authority. And so he says in verse 11, because this is where the next important piece for me comes in terms of the larger symbol. Verse 11 says, I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spoke as a dragon, and he exercised all the power of the first beast before him. So this is another piece that I think people miss. I mentioned earlier that often the case that people take the first beast here, whose wound was healed, as a reference to the human Antichrist, which I think the Antichrist may be included sort of in a larger sense with this first beast, but to just reduce to this first beast, this seven-headed beast, as a reference to the human Antichrist, the end times figure, I think is missing huge components of what the biblical information is trying to tell us. And with regard to the second beast, people look at this beast and say, well, this is just a religious figure. If you look at what he does, he causes people to worship the first beast and the dragon and the image of the beast, and he's doing miracles. So this is just some kind of religious figure. I think that's true. He will be a religious figure in that sense. He's going to be promulgating a false religion. But if you reduce this second beast to just a religious figure, I don't think you're doing service faithfully to the scriptural use of terms here. Even in this passage, it's already established that a beast is something that has, we're going to see, political power. That's what it means. If we ask, what is the first beast given by the dragon? Everybody pretty much understands, and I think this is correct, that the first beast, the head that's wounded and healed, at least, is given political power over the nations, as it says, over kindreds, tribes, tongues. And so if that second beast has all the same power, same Greek word, exousia, as the first beast before him, then what we're looking at here is two political entities of some kind. I'm using the term vaguely. That whatever the first beast is, the second beast is the same kind of thing. They're both beasts. They both have political power. And so that's an important thing to think about, because it's if that's what it means. And again, I'm just trying to interpret this in its own passage with what the term beast means. It seems to imply some sort of political operation, and we're going to see out, if we go to the passages that are connected to this, that seems to be inarguably true, and most people, I think, in the premillennial futurist camp and in general, accept that that's the case, at least with regard to the first beast, that he's got political power that's being described here. And if that's the case, then the second beast has political power too. And then we have to decide if they're two separate beasts, how does that work? Because most Christians conceive of one world government at the end of the age, or one particularly important world power, and the rest of them aren't really, whatever other governmental powers exist in the world at the end of the age, most Christians don't really think there's any great significance to them, in contrast to this first seven-headed beast, or the healed head, or whatever, of that seven-headed beast. But what Revelation 13 on its face value, to me, just basic symbols in their own terms, means there's two beasts. There's two beasts that have authority at this time. And we'll see why that's not a novel thing. That's, I think, suggested elsewhere. A couple of things about the second beast that we'll talk about in terms of symbol interpretation, but I just want to point them out here from the text. This beast so the first beast is, it's got leopard, bear, lion, 10 horns, 7 heads. That's the basic physical description of the first beast. We do have a basic physical description of the second beast here. It is, and what we're told is only really one factor about this thing physically. It has 2 horns like a lamb. Now, I just want to pause and make sure that we understand here that this is not 2 separate statements. It is not that this beast is like a lamb and it has 2 horns. It has 2 horns as a lamb has 2 horns. And the Greek, I think, supports that completely, that the only extent to which the second beast is lamb-like is in its 2-hornedness, if you'll let me use that phrase. So it has 2 horns as a lamb has 2 horns. It is not that it is like a lamb and also it has 2 horns. So I don't think the Greek or the intent of the passage allows us to separate those 2 things. And people often do separate those things and deal with the 2 horns in one way and the lamb-likeness in another way, in which they take lamb-likeness to be a reference to its Christian character, as Jesus is referred to in the New Testament as the Lamb of God. Well, that fact that Jesus is referred to even in the book of Revelation as the Lamb of God has a couple of issues with in terms of wanting to take it as a means to justify interpreting this beast to be like a Christian entity. And that is that in the entire use of symbols for political powers in the Bible that involves animals or beasts as imagery, those aren't used to describe their godly religious character in particular. I mean, a lamb here now, to take the type of animal as a reference to spiritual character, is out of sync, I think, with the way this is used. And that'll be more clear when we talk about this. I mean, bear, lion, and leopard and 10 horns are not being used to tell us what religion the peoples involved in these political powers are. In fact, they're all kind of grouped into the same religion. If you understand like some of the other references here, there's really, the Bible's concerned only two religious views. There's the godly one, and then there's the wrong one. So it's not trying to say, well, bear, because that's like this kind of religion, and leopard, that's like this kind of religion, and lamb means it appears to be Christian. That's not how these terms are being used. It's certainly not how they're being used in Daniel, which is the passage that Revelation is drawing from. Yeah, I'll come back to these other verses in Revelation in a moment, including Revelation 17, which is going to be important. Actually, we'll just read Revelation 17 now. In the beginning of Revelation 17, it talks about this woman that it refers to as a harlot, and that she rides this seven-headed beast. And so the description of the beast is the same in both chapters. And then in as you move through chapter 17, it explains, John gets more information about the seven-headed beast. And it says, the seven heads are seven mountains on which the woman sits and are seven kings. So you might notice that I omitted the English word there, which appears typically in English translations, where it says, seven heads are seven mountains on which the woman sits, and there are seven kings, as if, oh, by the way, there's also seven kings. In the Greek, this is just saying the seven heads are seven mountains and seven kings. Like the heads represent mountains and kings, seven in number in all cases. And the woman sits upon these. And so that, if you understand that this is a reference to kings, then the reference to mountains makes more sense, because a mountain is in other places in Scripture can be a reference to a people group or a nation or a kingdom, including in the book of Daniel. So what we're talking about is seven heads representing seven nations and their kings, seven kings over these different seven nations. And so then I'm going to skip this for now. We'll come back to it. Verse 8, 9, 10, and 11, particularly 10 and 11, will give us information about the nature of these kings, and some more information there, which is going to be important. So now I want to go back to Daniel, and you almost immediately have to go back to Daniel because of Revelation 13's first verses tell you basically, hey, go look at Daniel. There's a very particular connection here that can't really be missed, which is that both chapter 7 of Daniel and Revelation chapter 13 are both talking about beasts that are like lion, leopard, and bear. So, that's a peculiar set of things to have in common, and which aren't in common anywhere else. And so, okay, beasts and coming up out of the sea and onto the earth, and bear, lion, and leopard, and 10 horns. I think these chapters are probably connected. Most Christians make these connections, so I don't think I'm really going to have to work too hard on that. But let's look at Daniel 7. Verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, so this is during the Babylonian Empire, what might be called the Neo-Babylonian Empire by scholars today. And so Daniel's having this vision at this time of the Babylonians. And in verse 2, he says, behold, the four winds of heaven strove upon the great sea, and four great beasts came up from the sea, right? Just like the first beast of Revelation 13. You have the idea of beasts coming up out of the sea. And it says each one is different from one another, right? So they're different. And how are they different? Well, it's going to describe for us their differences. The first beast is like a lion. And then it explains some other things about the lion. I'm not going to get into those other components. The verse 5, it says, and behold another beast, a second beast, which is like a bear, and it's raised up on one side. And then in verse 6, it says, and beheld another, which was like a leopard, and it also had 4 heads. And then verse 7, I also saw a fourth beast. It was terrible and dreadful. And he says it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. So now we have 4 beasts here that rise up out of the sea. Don't get too hung up on that, because it'll explain, as Daniel gets the explanation in verse 17, these beasts are 4 kings which will arise out of the earth. So again, out of the earth and out of the sea, in all cases. Of the fourth beast here, it says that it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it. So when we look at these beasts, we say, well, okay, one of them is like a lion, one's like a leopard, one's like a bear. So we know the difference between those animals. I think most people can at least conceive of this. Children can conceive of the difference. That's how they're different from one another. They have some other features that are different as well. But one thing that's true about the last beast, where it's said, particularly with regard to this beast is different from the other 3. So if you suppose that it's the same as the other 3, you're not probably being faithful to the intent, at least the apparent intent of the author, to say the fourth beast is different from the other 3, and its prominent characteristic is that it has 10 horns. We don't really get an animal type for this fourth beast. So there are 4 kings that arise out of the earth. So kingdoms and kings arising up out of the earth. And then we get some potential information. Again, verse 19 saying the fourth beast is different from the other 3. And talks about the 10 horns on its head. And then it says the fourth beast will be a 4th kingdom upon the earth, which will be different from all kingdoms. So how many times does Daniel have to tell us that the fourth beast is different than the other ones, the lion, the bear, and the leopard? And then it says the 10 horns are out of that kingdom, this 4th kingdom, which are 10 kings that will arise. So we're going to end up having to ask this question about the fourth beast and its 10 horns. Do the 10 horns occur at the initial rise to power of this beast, or the 10 horns are the 10 horns representing a later period of power? So that in this fourth beast is occupying 2 sort of periods of history. That could be one of the ways in which it's different from the others. And it's going to end up, I think, pretty clearly indicating that this beast occupies 2 periods of history, and that the horns are representative of the later period of its history, and we'll see why. So the next thing I'm going to do is read Daniel 8. Daniel 8 isn't directly invoked in the first part of Revelation, although I do think it is invoked in the second part of Revelation 13. Just to be, Revelation 13 is what I mean. And I'll tell you why here in a second. And why it's useful is because we have the same sort of prophetic symbol imagery being used as in chapter 7 of Daniel and in Revelation 13. And I think Daniel here gets this information to help us understand how some of the characteristics of these animals, the features of these animals, what they mean in real terms of political power, because the features of the animals, whether they have horns or heads or what in particular, are meant to describe the structure or formation or dissolution of one of these empires into different smaller political or either formative parties that join together to create the empire, or which the empire splits apart into after its initial rise. So Daniel 8:2, Daniel has another vision, and verse 3 says, behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns. It had 2 horns. The 2 horns were high, but one horn was higher than the other. Okay, so we've got a ram with 2 horns. And this is why I think when I said Revelation 13 is invoking this chapter, because as I read in chapter 13, verse 11, it said, John sees a second beast arise out on the earth, and it says it had 2 horns like a lamb has 2 horns. Well, a lamb and a ram are the same kind of animal. So, to find Daniel, which is already being invoked in Revelation 13, 1 through 4, to find a similar reference in Revelation 13 to say, to referring to a ram-like animal, a young ram-like animal with two horns, doesn't seem to me to be able to be dismissed as mere coincidence. It seems like that may be informative and intended to be significant for us. And so when we read about this second beast, which has two horns as a lamb, we might say two horns like a young ram. That's a fair assessment, in that a ram and a lamb are the same kind of animal. It's just an age difference. Male rams are adults of the species, and then a lamb would be what you would use for the younger version. So that references here back to Daniel 7, where we see this description of a two-horned ram animal. And then it talks about how in verse 5, a he-goat, a goat came from the west, from the face of the earth. And this goat had one notable horn between his eyes. So unlike the ram, which has two horns, this has one horn. And the goat smote the ram and broke his two horns. And verse 8 says, the goat waxed very great. He became very powerful. And when he was strong, his horn was broken. And out of it came up four notable ones toward the four winds of heaven, and out of them came forth a little horn. So this goat has one horn when it starts. That horn is broken, and then instead of it, there are four horns, and then among those four horns grows up a little horn. And I know I didn't mention this when we did chapter 8, but among the 10 horns of the fourth beast, there is also reference to a little horn there. And so this is an important piece of information. If this little horn in chapter 7 and chapter 8 of Daniel is the same horn, then we have to understand how it relates to the different beast symbols in both chapters. But as I continue to read in chapter 8, Daniel does get a very plain language explanation of what these animals symbolize. In verse 20, he says, the ram that had two horns is the kings of Media and Persia, I should say. And the rough goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king of the Grecian Empire. And when that horn, that king, is broken, four other kings will stand up in that kingdom out of that nation, but not in the same strength or power as the first king. And in the latter time of their kingdom, a king of fierce countenance will arise. So that's the little horn. So right here between Daniel 7 and 8 and Revelation, and also Revelation 13 and 17, we get a ton of information about animals and what they represent and what heads represent and what horns represent and how they all work together. And if we simply look at that system that's presented for us from the scripture, it tells us a lot in Revelation without us having to do a great deal of speculative work about all the different possible meanings of what these things, these terms mean. If we just use them the way that the authors of these books use them, then we'll arrive at a pretty clear picture. I think many Christians have done most of this, like I said, with regard to the historical past. And so I want to kind of give the lay of the land in terms of the historical past. I also want to mention this component. So Revelation 4, verse 6 talks about a heavenly scene in which John is seeing God the Father on the throne. He sees Jesus Christ in the heavenly setting there in the throne room. But here in chapter 4, as he's chronicling this, he explains, okay, there's these elders there, and there's other things going on, and he's describing in some cases heavenly beings or angelic beings. And he explains this, which again is present in the book of Ezekiel, these angels that appear to look like animals in some respects. Verse 7, it says, verse 6 talks about four beasts that are before the throne of God. So here we have the same word beast that's used in Revelation 13 being used in this case to refer to good angels who were before God's throne in the heavenly throne room. And it says, and the first beast is like a lion, the second's like a calf or a bull, and the third has the face of a man, and the fourth like an eagle. So the reason I'm bringing this up in the context of discussing the seven-headed beast and these other beasts from Daniel is that the book of Revelation and elsewhere in the scripture, but here's one of the clear examples of it, uses the term beast to describe angelic beings. We probably don't want to leave that out of our consideration of how beasts are being used in the book of Revelation. And so in addition to suggesting what I think the text clearly states, which is that these beasts in Daniel and Revelation represent kingdoms on earth, earthly human kingdoms, and kings, that we might also understand that they represent angels which are somehow connected to each kingdom. And that's going to become even more clear when we look at some of these additional texts in the book of Revelation. And so let me go up and read some of the ones that I skipped moments ago, starting with, let's start with Revelation 17. Describing the seven-headed beast and the mystery of the seven-headed beast in chapter 17, it explains, the beast that you saw, that was and is not, will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. So if you were just reading this out of context, out of the flow and the organization of Revelation's presentation of information, which is kind of how I just did it, you might just think that this is a reference to the seven-headed beast, but it isn't. This particular phrase in verse 8 is intended to be distinct. There's a beast that will ascend out of the bottomless pit. Now that phrase is not used in Revelation 13. It's used first in Revelation 9, where there is a point where I believe it's an angelic figure opens what is called the bottomless pit with a key. And out of that pit come various spiritual or supernatural beings. I think it's mostly angelic beings there. And it specifies in verse 11 that of all these beings that come up out of the abyss, out of the bottomless pit, they have a king that rules over them, that is in charge of them, that is in authority over them, who is the angel of or over the bottomless pit. So this angel rules over the bottomless pit. He is a king who comes up out of the bottomless pit. In fact, if you look at the description in verse 2, where it says the bottomless pit's open and there arose smoke out of the pit and locusts come upon the earth. Well, the word arose here is the same word that's used in chapter 17 to say ascend. So something's coming out of the bottomless pit. Revelation 9:11 talks about an angel king who comes out of the bottomless pit. Revelation 17:8 talks about a beast that comes out of the bottomless pit. And in between those, we have Revelation 11:7, which talks about the two witnesses, and it talks about this beast that is mentioned in verse 17, but with this statement. It says in verse 7 of chapter 11, when the two witnesses have finished their testimony, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war against them. Well, prior to verse 7 of chapter 11, there has never been a discussion of a beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit, but there has been a discussion of an angel king that ascends out of the bottomless pit. So if we would use this in concert with one another, we would have an operating hypothesis that the angel king is a beast. And that makes sense because we know that angels can be referred to as beasts, as they are of good angels in Revelation chapter 4. And so we're also going to talk about Daniel in this respect as well. But if you take that information and you go into chapter 17 and you talk about this seven-headed beast, and which has 10 horns and names of blasphemy, right? That's the description of the same thing that's in Revelation 13, 1-3, a seven-headed beast with 10 horns and names of blasphemy. And then verse 8-11 explains more about the seven-headed beast. And it says, the beast that came out of the bottomless pit is one of these heads. That's what it's going to say. So we know that verse 8 is stipulating this angel king is a beast, that he comes out of the bottomless pit. And so now we've got this confirmation of angels as beasts, angels as kings, and somehow associated with the heads, the seven heads of this beast. And so look at verse 9. Here is wisdom. The seven heads are seven mountains and seven kings upon which the woman sits. 5 have fallen, one is, the other is not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short space. So we're going to pay more attention to that sentence in a moment. But look at verse 11. The beast that was and is not Even he is the eighth, but he's one of the seven, and he goes to perdition. So verse 11 and verse 8 are talking about the same beast. It's a king. That makes sense, right? Because chapter 9 introduces him as an angel king who arises out of the bottomless pit, who ascends out of the bottomless pit. So we know that Revelation 9:11, Revelation 17:8, and Revelation 17:11, and also Revelation 7:11, verse 7, I should say, are all talking about the same angelic figure. And that tells us something pretty important about all seven heads. Because each head represents a king, in each king, this king is an angel. The other six kings that are in view here are probably the angelic kings. Now, that's not to deny that the earthly nations that are associated with these angel kings did not also have prominent human rulers. The Bible talks about some of them: Nebuchadnezzar of the Babylonians, Cyrus of the Persians, Alexander of the Greeks, although he's not named by the name Alexander in the biblical text. And then we also know about Augustus, who was the first emperor of the Roman Empire. So there certainly were those men, as well as their successors, those who came after them. But the Bible seems here in chapter 17 to be interested in the angelic kings, not the human rulers, which is important. When we talk about this in the context of Revelation 13 of a seven-headed beast and what beasts represent are kings and kingdoms, we know that the kingdoms are earthly kingdoms. The Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks. Daniel 8 indicates that with regard to the use of symbols there. And the same would be true for Daniel chapter 7, which we'll talk about, and identifying these kingdoms. So it's earthly kingdoms. And then all those earthly kingdoms had human kings. But the Bible's also interested in highlighting through the image of the seven heads, the angelic kings, not the human ones. So that's, I think, pretty clear from Revelation 9:11, 11:7, and 17:8 and 11, that the seven heads represent seven angelic kings, not human kings. So then it explains to us in chapter 17 that the 10 horns, which are on this seven-headed beast of Revelation 13, they are 10 kings who have not received a kingdom yet, right? So that's interesting. It means that by the time John wrote this in the late first century, these kings had not, their power did not exist. Their kingdoms did not exist. Their authority, their political entity did not exist in the world yet. They will at one point, but it stipulates here they will only receive authority with the beast for 1 hour, and it's implied that that is at the end of the age. It's more than implied. If you read forward, it says these 10 have one mind, one purpose, to give their authority to the beast. What beast? The beast that ascended out of the bottomless pit. It's indicating here that these 10 kings, which will arise at some point after the first century, at the very least, that's all we can tell for sure from this, will give their kingdoms to the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit. And so this makes sense in terms of what Daniel is explaining both in chapter 7 and chapter 8, and what we see in chapter 13 of Revelation, which is in chapter 7 and 8 of Daniel, we have these examples of animals with horns and animals with heads. And so I'm going to just do the basic breakdown, and this isn't particularly controversial or won't necessarily be new to people who have studied this from a premillennial futurist point of view. But the understanding is that the lion in both Daniel chapter 7 and in Revelation, seven-headed beast, the lion reference is to the Babylonian Empire. Featured predominantly in the book of Daniel under Nebuchadnezzar, who's a major figure in chapter 2 in particular, who hears about the future and the future of these kingdoms, and we'll talk about Daniel 2 at some point. If the lion is Babylon, or the Babylonian Empire, then after the Babylonian Empire comes the Persians, or we would say the Medo-Persians. And if you look at the book of Daniel as well as history, what we know about the Medes and the Persians is that it was two very closely related but yet distinct people groups, the Medes and the Persians. And they came together. They had a situation where the kings of one, or the royal line of one of these people, would intermarry with the others. And so you end up with this situation where you've got this guy Cyrus the Great, who's descended from the Medes on one side and the Persians on the other. And they have this kingdom that is included in its governing rules, something called the law of the Medes and the Persians. And so this is why the bear, which comes after the Babylonian lion, has raised up on one side, because it's got two sides and two nations. One of them is more important than the other. It was the Persians that ultimately took this these two groups of people, and made them the preeminent world power. That didn't really happen under the Medes, which were kind of they were in charge first, and then the Persians sort of took over, and then took over the Babylonian Empire under the Persian leadership, under that sort of banner. So when you get to chapter 8 and you see the reference to the ram, that is a reference to the Persians, and it has two horns, that's the two nations, the Medes and the Persians. It says that specifically, and indicates one horn is higher than the other. So this is very informative for a number of reasons. With regard to the second beast of Revelation 13:11, it has two horns like a young ram, which, if we're reading Daniel, which we seem like we should be, and we're reading chapter 7 and chapter 8, we would walk away with the idea that the second beast of Revelation, chapter 13, verse 11, which has two horns, not 10. There's two beasts in Revelation. One has 10 horns, one has two different political powers. The two-horned beast is somehow like, in its political structure, somehow like the Medes and the Persians, which would mean it's comprised of two nations symbolized by two horns. It may even be the case that in the second beast of Revelation 11, that one of the horns is higher than the other, just like it was with the Medes and the Persians. So at least we can see that continuity of the symbols being applied there, which gives us a pretty important piece that sometimes people miss about the second beast of Revelation, which is this is in the same sense of all these other empires, it is a major world empire that is around at the end of the world. Just like the Babylonians and the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans, the second beast of Revelation, chapter 13, verse 11, is a major world power that is comprised of two nations, just as much of a world power, at least in that region or in some way, as all these other predecessors. But we also have the 10-horn beast. There's both of them, right? They both have authority at that time, according to Revelation 13. But if we follow the succession from Daniel and history, we have the Babylonians, then the Medes and Persians, which are joined sort of as the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire. And then after them comes what we in biblical circles typically call the Greek Empire. You might see referred to as the Macedonian Empire, because Philip of Macedon's son, Alexander the Great, is the one who really gets this empire to this position of power. And it's huge. It just spans this huge region from Greece over to India. And that's the first king. I mean, Daniel's almost just handing that to us, this first king of the Greek Empire, the goat that has one horn in Daniel 8. Now, he explains in chapter 8 that after Alexander's death, by way of prophetic indications, but from history, his kingdom fell into four others who were less than him. In fact, the kingdom becomes really ruled pretty quickly by his four generals, which each take a piece of the kingdom. And then those kings and the kings that come out of Alexander, they also get used in Daniel's prophecy to tell us something about the future of the history and the end times, which we'll get to later, but using those as a reference. But in chapter 7, if we follow the progression from chapter 7, we now have a correspondence between the bear, which follows the Babylonians, and the ram in chapter 8, which is the group that is present at the beginning of chapter 8. And both of those seem to be representative in terms of their succession in history as the Medes and the Persians. And the symbol are similar, right? A horn that's higher versus a bear that's raised up on one side, coming after the Babylonians. And then in addition, what succeeds them also helps identify them. In both cases of chapter 7 and chapter 8, you have in chapter 7, a leopard with four heads succeeding the bear. In chapter 8, it's a goat that has four horns succeeding the bear. And so the four heads and the four horns there seem to be showing the same peculiar, unique detail to this kingdom that comes after the Medes and Persians, both fitting the Greeks, because as I said, we know that after Alexander, whose reign was short-lived, He dies in his early 30s. And then very quickly, his kingdom is run by his 4 generals who each take a piece of it for themselves. And so the progression, the characteristic features of these animals, even though we have different animals in chapter 9 being used to kind of help us with the understanding of what some of these symbol terms like horns and heads mean, and then give us some real world applications to history and identifiers with the Medes and Persians and the Greeks. Now we can see this. Okay, well, that's the first 3 kingdoms starting in the time of Daniel with Babylon. That was the kings that Daniel started with under Nebuchadnezzar. And then there's this 4th beast, which has 10 horns, and it's like all the other ones. And then we know that this 4th beast, in some respects, it must be have some correspondence to the very end of the world, because this little horn that comes up is kind of part of that feature. We also see in the book of Revelation that the 10 horns of that beast feature prominently both in chapter 13 and in chapter 17, where we're told that these are kings that only receive power sort of at the end of the age, when the angel king comes out of the abyss and he receives power from them. So that's kind of interesting, an interesting feature about this 10-horned beast of Daniel and the 10-horned beast, or the use of the horns in Revelation 13. And I just want to pause for a second there and make sure that I'm not being confusing, but to deal with this issue, which is sometimes people take the 10-horned beast of Daniel, which is Daniel 7's 4th beast, right? Lion, bear, leopard, 10-horned beast. And then they say that 4th beast of Daniel 7 is the same beast featured in Revelation 13, 1 through 3. I feel like that's just not fair to the text of Daniel or Revelation, because what that would mean is that Daniel was presenting a lion, a bear, a leopard, and then a 10-horned beast, which is like a lion, like a bear, and like a leopard. And yet Daniel says repeatedly that 10-horned beast is not like the lion, the bear, or the leopard. So to me, there's already a real sticking point and problem there. The other is that Daniel does present the idea of multiple heads on the leopard, and it's 4, and yet he doesn't say anything about the 10-horned beast in Daniel 7 having more than 1 head. If it had 7 heads, I think Daniel would have told us. It seems like that's significant. So what it seems to me is that we have in Daniel chapter 7, the 4th beast, the 10-horned beast there, is 1 kingdom. But in Revelation 13, what we're getting is not a fuller description of Daniel's 4th beast, but merely a description of something bigger than what is covered in Daniel's 4 beasts. And that what we're seeing, if we use the terms again, is that head of a beast can itself represent a kingdom that is attached to the larger power, but a smaller representation of it, as it would be in the case of the Greeks as a leopard or 4 horns. These were subsequent powers that came out of the larger initial base of the Macedonian Greek Empire under Alexander. So if that's the case, then when we go to the Revelation 13 and we get a 7-headed beast, what we're talking about is 7 kingdoms whose power is derived from the same larger authority. In this case, it's not 4 kingdoms derived from the authority of the Macedonian Greek kingdom under Alexander's authority, but it's 7 kingdoms who have power as a result of the dragon's authority. If you read the description, Revelation 13 indicates that it's the dragon that is giving power to this 7-headed beast. And in part of that comes from the fact that in chapter 12, the devil and his angels, described there as the dragon or the serpent, are also described as a 7-headed beast with 10 horns, which shows at least that there's a correspondence between, again, the angels and these earthly kingdoms. And since we know from chapter 17 and chapter 9, 11, and so forth, that the heads of the 7-headed beast are angel kings, and we know from chapter 12 that the same description of the dragon and his angels is applied, 7 heads, 10 horns, that each one of these heads of the 7-headed beast, whether it's in chapter 12, chapter 13, or chapter 17, is an angelic king who rules over an earthly kingdom. And one of these angelic kings who had been stripped of his power, who'd been wounded, he is restored to power by being released from the abyss, having been incarcerated at some point. And then the 10 horns which have arisen since his incarceration, and they arise at the very end, it seems, at the very final years, they give their kingdoms, their 10 kingdoms, to him so he can rule again. And so he is allowed to continue the authority that he had before he had been incarcerated in the abyss. And so there's a couple things that are really interesting about how this fits together. And I want to just mention a couple of them before to get them into tonight's section. We may not stop exactly at 8. If you do need to leave at that time, that's cool. We'll record all this if you want to catch up on it. But so if you read through some of these other places in the scripture, this idea of angels ruling over the nations isn't really shocking, or shouldn't be shocking to any of us. And I'm just going to get down to a couple of places that I want to reference on this. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 19. If you read through the books of Moses, particularly starting in Exodus, but you can see it already in Genesis with God selecting Abraham, is that God's like decided at this point, his plan is, I'm going to pick a person, Abraham, and his descendants, so that that nation that comes from his descendants, they're going to belong to me. And I'm going to protect them, and I'm going to give them my law so that they can live in accordance with what's right. And I will cultivate in them this culture of righteousness and obedience, or at least that's his intent, is to preserve his teachings and his commands through them, through that time period. And so he's got this covenant with the people of Israel. It's a unique covenant that has that continues to this day. It's in my understanding, it's how Gentile people like me come to faith in the Jewish Messiah King, Jesus Christ, who is the person of God who appears to the Jewish people throughout the Old Testament. And we can now be a part of that covenant people that God has with Israel through Jesus, through faith in him. So we become near and part of that covenant with Israel, as I understand it, as the New Testament seems to teach, as far as I'm concerned or aware. And so in the Old Testament, though, God cultivates and selects that one people, and he says, I'm taking this people out of servitude in Egypt. They're going to be mine. But what he has to say in those books about the rest of the nations is this, and this is just a succinct place to get this, Deuteronomy 4:19. It says, Moses is saying, when you lift up your eyes to the heavens, and you see the sun, and you see the moon, and you see the stars, and all the hosts of heavens, that you would be driven to worship them and serve them. Like he's warning them about this proclivity, which the Lord, thy God, has divided unto all the nations under the whole of heaven. So if you read this in context and in concert with some other places where this is mentioned, what this is saying is that the people of Israel, that nation in particular, belongs to God, which is why Daniel says of Michael, the archangel, that he's the chief angel, prince, king, whatever term you want to use, the angelic prince who rules over or works with the people of Israel, represents their cause in heaven. He's working under God, under the Father, under Jesus Christ. Then Michael's working on behalf of the people of Israel. These other nations, they've got their other gods, right? And those other gods are in fact angels who are given charge over those nations. In fact, here it's indicating that God has divided all of the other nations, all of the Gentile nations, to what is called the host of heaven, which is a way of, in other places, of referring to angels in the scripture. Sometimes it refers to like celestial bodies, but it refers to angels, or sometimes both. The terms are used that way. The important thing, that one of the other interesting things about this, and we talked about this in our last study, I think, in the Four Horsemen, is that in the ancient world, the sun and the moon and the stars referred to 7 particular heavenly bodies, not like the star that is the center of our solar system, the moon that orbits the earth, and then all the other lights in the sky, which is how we often think about it as we distinguish between planets and stars and other solar systems and comets and such. The ancient world, prior to the modern concepts and terminology, they had these things called, if you look it up, I think a good place to look is Wikipedia. I think it's called the 7 classical planets is their article. But in the ancient classical understanding of what a planet was, using the term different than the way we use it, it included 7 objects: the sun, the moon, and then Venus, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And the reason that this is interesting to me is that there are 7 in number of them. Like, we wouldn't pick up on that from reading Deuteronomy 4:19, but that's what would have been commonly known in the ancient world, that association. And yet in Revelation, we have this idea of these 7 angel kings that are associated with 7 earthly nations. And here Deuteronomy is already talking about that. All the different Gentiles had different angels which ruled over them, and that they worshiped as gods. In Ephesians, Paul says in chapter 6, verse 12, but we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, princes, powers or authorities, against rulers of darkness in this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. So again, this is affirming something that Deuteronomy is saying. Even the devil says this to Jesus, which is, I've been given all authority. I can give it to over the kingdoms of the earth to give whoever I want. Revelation says that plainly, that the dragon has authority over the nations, and he gives that to whoever he wants to, including to these other angels that are associated with him. And so this idea, which, Daniel chapter 10 also includes, right? Gabriel, this angel, comes to Daniel to tell him about some things. And Gabriel explains in chapter 10, he says, I was coming to you as soon as you started praying, but then I was held up by the prince of Persia who kept me from coming to you for 3 weeks. And he says, but then Michael helped me. And so I was able to get to you. And he says, after the prince of Persia, after I go back, then there's going to be the prince of Greece. Well, he's telling us the same nations that Daniel's been told about in these other visions, the Babylonians and the Persians and the Greeks, in the same order in this case, have angels. And I know I'm interpreting that Daniel 11 is talking about angels, but Gabriel's being withheld from answering Daniel's prayer, having been sent by God by a prince of the Persians, and then he and Michael are fighting against that prince. So I think the reasonable deduction here is that that's an angelic figure, as is the prince of Greece that's going to come. And then I think Daniel 9:26 references the prince of the 4th kingdom that would come after the Greeks, and when it refers to the people of the prince who will come, will destroy the city and the sanctuary. So it's talking about the ultimate destruction of the 2nd temple, which occurred under the Romans. So again, Daniel has a pretty consistent depiction of the period from his point in time, which started with the Babylonians, through to the coming of Christ and his death, and is Daniel 9 verse 24, 25, 26 talk about, and that would be under the Romans. And that is generally how most Christians in the premillennial futurist camp have taken this. In fact, it was commonly understood by the Jews to work that way too. The Jewish people of ancient periods, even in the New Testament or rabbinic literature. So if you go to Jewish Encyclopedia and you look up Book of Revelation in Jewish Encyclopedia, it's going to give you some information that's relevant to this. It says, it's necessary to bear in mind that since the days of Pompey, Rome was, in the eyes of the Jewish apocalyptic writers, the 4th beast in Daniel's apocalypse. So even before the time of Christ, the Jewish people understood Daniel to lay out a series of kingdoms, starting with Babylon, then going to the Medo-Persian or Persian Empire, then the Greeks, and then ultimately Rome was the 4th beast of Daniel. Now, as I said, the 4th beast of Daniel has some additional interesting things about it that indicate it may be in more than one time period, because the 10 horns, as we eventually find out, are something that's after the time of the 1st century. That's not really, the 10 horns don't even exist till the end. And so there's this odd feature about this 4th beast of Daniel, which it seems to be present through the 1st century, but then it is also present again at the end of the age, which makes sense in one way more than it makes sense in most other ways, which is when people talk about the revived empire, the revived head of Revelation 13, and if they can get around the idea of a human who's shot in the head, and they've worked past that, or they're thinking of besides that, and they're talking about, oh, okay, let's talk about the earthly empire, you will sometimes see people make the statement that what we're talking about is the revival of the Roman European empire of the ancient world. And I think they are correct in their association and that they're on track towards something, but they're not tracking the right part of it. What we should be tracking, or at least I'm going to throw this alternative out there, but I think this is more compelling based upon Revelation's statements, is the restoration of power to the angel king who once ruled over what was initially a European-based power of the Roman Empire, but not necessarily the restoration of power to a European-based 10-horned empire of the end days. So that what is in concert or continuity between ancient Rome and the end times is the angel that rules both ancient Rome and the 10 horns. But the geographic base or the ethnic base of the people group may be different in both cases. What Revelation 17 is focusing on is the continuity of the angel and his being restored to power, not necessarily on the restoration of power to a European Latin group that originates out of the area of the peninsula of Italy. And one of the reasons that I'll suggest this, and we'll talk more about this in later weeks, is if you look at each of these empires that Daniel and Revelation are talking about, certainly Daniel, they have huge geographic spreads. They all originate in one small place and then spread vastly across to some other area far, far away. The Romans went from the furthest west all the way east over to Persia or Iran at one point in time. The Persians start all the way over in Iran, and they sweep all the way eastward over to Greece and over towards northern Africa and Libya. The Greeks go from not quite as far west as the Romans, but then they sweep over to India. The Egyptians in the south, and so we'll talk about this as well, because and this will be sort of where I'll wind down for tonight. But if we take the basic information about heads and seven-headed beasts and multiple heads on a beast and multiple horns and use it in concert with Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, we end up with the idea that there are 7 angelic rulers or kings. They're satanic angels who rule over 7 particular earthly empires. That's coming out of Revelation. Daniel features 4 of them in more than 4 time periods potentially, but 4 of these kingdoms, or at least 4 of the kingdoms on earth that these angels ruled. So those 4 kingdoms correspond to 4 angelic kings or rulers. Daniel does not cover the 2 that preceded Babylon. He's starting with Babylon forward. So Daniel gives us 4 beasts. Revelation is indicating there are 7 total. And then Revelation invokes the references to Daniel 7's particular 4 kingdoms or empires to say that's part of the chain, that's part of the series. And so then we have to identify who the other 3 heads are, or other 3 empires, or that are in Revelation 7, Revelation 13, 7-headed beast, right? Because Daniel's kind of given us 4. History kind of helps us with Daniel. Other writers in the Bible and Jewish traditions identify them as Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. And then we would need to know who are the other 3. And so I'm going to piece that together in future weeks. I will say this, that the 7th one, the one that comes after Rome, is going to be important. And what we have to keep in mind is that, according to Revelation, and we'll also get some of this from Daniel 2, that there are 2 of them in the end times, which is another thing that is very unique, at least in terms of the highlight. There was always a transitional period between one of these kingdoms and the other. Obviously, it's not like the Babylonians disappear and then sometime later the Persians come up. The Babylonians are there. The Persians are a vassal state dependent on and paying tribute to the Babylonians until the Persians rise up, challenge the Babylonians, and defeat them. And so there was a period where both of them were warring with one another before the Babylonians fall and the Persians become ascendant. So in the same way, what we may be viewing in the end times is a period where there's one beast that's already in power, and then the angel king comes out of the abyss. He gets power from these 10 horns, and they are ascendant, and they're trying to become preeminent. And we're watching that transition in a very short period of time, because it's all condensed into a 3.5-year period. When we look back at the Babylonians and the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans, it's taking place over many, many, many years. Those transitions from one to the other are taking place over decades, if not longer. But in the end times, it's happening quickly in a 3.5-year period or a 7-year period at the longest when the Bible's focused on these things. And the one other thing I'll say tonight before I close, just to make sure that we're stating this, is that why does God pick these 7 empires? Of all the empires that existed in the world, there's empires all over. Here in the Americas, we got the Incas, the Aztecs, the Mayas. There's these Native American civilizations that are very impressive in what they're doing here, but they're isolated from other parts of the world, right? There's empires within the continent of Africa that are, again, more isolated from what's going on in the biblical, historical, the centrality of where Israel is, where Asia, Europe, and Africa come together. There's Eastern and further northern, and there's European cultures that are prominent prior to the Romans and Greeks, or in their own sphere are prominent. So why does the Bible pick these particular ones and these particular points in history? And there's one feature that's common throughout the ones that are mentioned in Daniel and the other 2 that we'll talk about that come before Babylon, and that is every single one of these kingdoms has in common that they ruled over the majority, or they were a prominent world power that included interaction with and dominance over the land of Israel when the people of Israel were in that land as their own nation, and when they had possession of Jerusalem and a temple. So, and I know people are probably thinking about Egypt, and maybe they're thinking about Egypt in terms of the Exodus, but Egypt isn't just reduced to the Exodus experience. And all of these kingdoms that we know about, including the ones that in the end by reference and by symbol, the Bible's interested in them because they rule when God's people are living in the land of Israel with the temple. So that's an important feature to keep in mind, and it will be as we look at the 7th kingdom that's going to come after Rome and begin to investigate that. So I'm going to pause the recording here, and then we'll resume with more information and looking at this more next week. After we pause, we can do prayer requests or keep talking or chat about this if you guys want to. So give me 1 second.